The Ice Age is not scary, because we have the power to render its consequences to have no effect on our living. Nor is this power and its principles a secret. The video presentation introduces no new thing. No esoteric magic is involved in understanding the Ice Age dynamics and our power to respond to them in a manner that enriches our world and our living in it. The facts that this video presents are known scientific facts that are discernible by everyone. No esoteric theories are involved. The truth is knowable and widely known. However, there is a need to draw the facts together, which together present an amazing challenge. The challenge may be scary for its magnitude, but it isn't, because we can meet and master the challenge and do it with joy. The present world is scary. The present world is unsurvivable in the long run. Nuclear war is unsurvivable. The engines for our doom stood precariously close for 70 years, and they are getting more sophisticated and dangerous. For 70 years we have struggled to eliminate this danger and have failed. We are no closer to a solution today than we were when we started. The Ice Age, in comparison, should we take up the challenge, offers peace, joy, security, and riches beyond dreams. The Ice Age becomes scary only when we deny it and refuse its challenges. Then it becomes our doom, and more certainly so than nuclear war. But why should we deny the Ice Age before us, and thereby deny ourselves? We are the supreme being on this planet, with the capacity to scientifically understand our world and to create ourselves a future by letting its needs determine the present. It actually isn't hard to do this. It begins with asking us, who are we? Where are we? Where do we want to be? And what must we do to get there? What would inspire us to take the necessary steps? The question where we are in time and space isn't a hard one to answer. We live in a galaxy that is presently at its weakest state in 440 million years. Our solar system is a part of this extremely weak galaxy. Our Sun is one of the galaxy's 400 billion stars. The climate on Earth, as one of the Sun's planets, is determined by all of these factors acting together, from the galactic to the solar to the planetary systems. We live in a climate that is by itself an anomaly. The anomaly is ending. We are about to get back to our normal climate. The Earth's normal climate for 85% of the last 2 million years has been harsh and cold. We call the period of glaciation the Ice Age. The next Ice Age, which defines our normal climate, will likely start in the 2050s under a 70% colder sun. I have produced numerous videos with explorations of the dynamics that lead to threshold conditions in the solar process, beyond which the electromagnetic primal fields can no longer be maintained that presently energize the sun in its high-powered mode. I have explored in these videos what it means when the sun reverts back to its normal, low-powered mode, with 70% less energy being radiated, from which an ice age results, with such a deep global cooling that all regions outside the tropics become rapidly uninhabitable. I have proposed in those videos that we really have no option for our continued living on the Earth except to relocate ourselves into the tropics before the next ice age begins. I have proposed further that the lack of suitable land in the tropics would force us to relocate ourselves afloat onto the equatorial seas together with our agriculture between the hurricane zones. I proposed that this would involve a whole new agricultural revolution and a powerful new industrial revolution with a productive power that supersedes everything that has been accomplished in the past. I proposed that we would build 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each for the relocation project, and that these can be produced so efficiently in high-temperature automated industrial processes that they can be provided for one another for free as an investment by society into itself. The typical response that I have received on this line was that this will never happen. It just won't happen. I would like to propose that all this will happen indeed, and that the great project will be carried out with joy for the sheer fun of us building ourselves a new world. I would like to propose that the building will begin soon, because the floating infrastructures will be needed long before the next ice age begins. They will be needed to protect our food supply and our cities from flooding, droughts, earthquakes, and also from hurricanes, all of which promise to become massively increased and more devastating in the years ahead because of our rapidly diminishing sun and the resulting consequences. Floating agriculture and cities cannot be flooded by the worst rainfall, nor can earthquakes affect them, or hurricanes reach them. Hurricanes are not possible near the equator for roughly 500 kilometers on either side. For all of these reasons, the massive floating infrastructures will be built. They will be built because all of these so-called natural catastrophes are in the process of becoming ever larger and ever more devastating in the years ahead, with no end in sight till the next ice age begins, which then adds its own dimension of challenges. The video presented here is designed to focus on the cosmic connection that is underlying the big flooding events, earthquake events, and hurricane events, and their rapidly increasing severity, for which the floating infrastructures will be built without fail, even while their absolute necessity for the next ice age still lays ahead of us by about 30 years, at which time the current interglacial warm holiday ends and a new era begins. Everything that we have known and experienced as our climate on Earth is presently collapsing towards the point of phase shift that changes everything. The start of the next ice age results from a phase shift in the solar system. When this takes place, our entire world becomes radically transformed. The world then reverts back to its normal, deep, cold climate shown here in blue. The collapse towards the all-changing phase shift has been going on gradually for the last 3,500 years. The long, drawn-out collapse has been physically measured in ice core samples from the Greenland ice sheet. More of the fine details for the last 1,000 years came to light through measurements of carbon-14 ratios gleaned from samples from these times. Carbon-14 ratios stand as proxy with which we are able to measure the solar activity at the time the samples were created. The measurements prove that the gradual climate collapse that occurred during this period, including that of the Little Ice Age from the 1300s till the end of the Maunder Minimum, was the direct result of the diminishing strength of the solar activity. When the Sun is weaker, the plasma corona surrounding it is weaker likewise, which enables larger volumes of cosmic ray flux to escape the solar environment and impact the Earth. That's what the carbon-14 ratios measure. The measured ratio is inversely presented on the graph to match the corresponding climate effect. Another proxy that stands for solar activity is found in beryllium-10 ratios. Beryllium-10 is likewise radioactive, an isotope that is exclusively produced by cosmic ray interaction with the atmosphere. Again, this ratio is inversely plotted because high cosmic ray volumes cause cold climates on Earth. It is interesting to note that the measured beryllium-10 ratios, which fluctuate with the solar cycles, indicate that the solar cycles did continue during the weakest phase of the Sun during the Little Ice Age, when no sunspots had occurred for a few decades, which normally reflect the strength of solar cycles. The carbon-14 measurements tell us that at the time of the Little Ice Age in the 1600s, when the solar activity was the weakest and the climate the coldest, the cosmic ray volume had been the largest ever recorded. The measured ratio also tells us that in the 1700s, a cosmic event occurred that had reversed the historic weakening of the Sun and ramped the Sun up again. The up-ramping of the Sun gave us almost 300 years of solar-caused global warming that ended in the 1960s, when the solar activity began to collapse again. As I had noted in previous videos, according to the historically recorded sunspot numbers, the 300 years global warming period had peaked out in the 1960s and began to collapse shortly thereafter. When one looks more closely, however, it becomes apparent that the turnaround wasn't clean and linear. The sun became dramatically weaker in the 1970s, according to the sunspot numbers, then recovered slightly in the 1980s and 90s, and collapsed again steeply thereafter, which still continues. On the chart presented here, the solar diminishment is measured in diminishing sunspot numbers. The diminishing numbers typically stand as a broad overview proxy for diminishing solar activity. Unfortunately, the sunspot numbers remain as our only proxy for solar activity from the 1950s on, when the carbon-14 values became irrelevant by the effect of the nuclear bombing and bomb testing, which also produced carbon-14. As I had also noted in previous videos, the diminishing solar activity, which is reflected in diminishing sunspot numbers from the 1960s on, has resulted in colder climates on Earth. This too became eventually measurable. It was measured in the form of diminishing average annual soil temperature that began to drop off from 1997 on. The soil temperature measurements were conducted by the Solar Terrestrial Institute in Irkutsk in southern Siberia. The colder Earth, in this case, didn't result from the sun being colder, but resulted from increased solar cosmic ray flux that increased cloudiness. As I had pointed out previously, that a colder Earth results as a consequence of increased solar cosmic ray flux, because the cosmic ray ionization of the atmosphere boosts the cloud-forming process up to 100-fold. The consequence is that the increased cloudiness reflects a greater portion of the sunlight that would normally be received on Earth back into space. The increased loss is felt in the form of the Earth getting colder. The effect that cosmic ray flux has on cloud nucleation is no longer a mere theory. It has been proved as an undeniable fact in laboratory experiments in Europe. The CERN lab in the Cloud Experiment series, a large test chamber was filled with water vapor. The natural nucleation rate was measured, which was expected to be minuscule. Then the normal enhancement factors were added, such as an electric potential. A significant increase in the nucleation rate was obtained. This was also expected. After that, artificial cosmic rays were injected into the test chamber from a particle accelerator. The result was amazing. The measured increase went straight up and off the chart. This too is what one would expect as a verification of the theorized 100-fold increase in cloud nucleation that solar cosmic ray flux can achieve. With its cloud experiment series, the CERN lab proves in principle that all climate changes on Earth are the direct effect of cosmic changes. Variable cloudiness, driven by the largely variable solar cosmic ray flux, is the self-evidently big variable factor that causes all climate changes on Earth, second to none. The cosmic effects are huge effects, with the sun being the originator of the climate on Earth. The factors that vary its effect on the Earth render all climate changes to be exclusively cosmic climate changes, not man-made climate changes. The key factor that drives the climate changes is, in every case, the cosmic factor that varies the volume of solar cosmic ray flux. Its ionizing effect that increases water vapor nucleation for enhanced cloud condensation is a secondary effect. The primary cause is always cosmic in nature. It is a cause that is affecting the sun. The cosmic factors are big. We have no way of affecting them. It would be wonderful if we had this capability. Ironically, the increased cosmic ray flux also causes increased drought conditions. Faster cloud nucleation causes the clouds to rain out faster, which reduces their water transport distance. The California drought may be the result of the shorter water transport distance, with the precipitation flowing from east to west. And at times when the solar cosmic ray flux is exceptionally strong, the more intense cloud nucleation also causes sudden flash floods and torrential rainfalls, especially in areas where the conditions are favorable for cloudiness to begin with. We see more of both types of flooding now happening as the sun is rapidly getting weaker. We see more flooding events occurring all over the world from the mid-1950s on, with higher water levels during the floods. The larger cosmic ray values that we would see reflected again from the 1960s on, in larger carbon-14 ratios, if these could be correctly measured, results from the sun getting weaker again from this time onward. The increasing cosmic ray flux would necessarily result in increased rainfall and floods of the type that we see already happening again. But what about rainfall and floods in historic times? We have large C14 ratios measured in samples from historic times. These high ratios were produced by correspondingly large volumes of cosmic solar ray flux. Shouldn't large flooding events have been occurring in these times? Historic flood records indicate that large floods had indeed happened in exactly those times, and of the relative magnitude that one would expect to see. In a town in Germany, located on the Danube River, some of the historic flood levels were inscribed on a wall. The inscription notes some of the highlights of the 500 years period from 1501 on that takes us back in time deep into the Little Ice Age. According to the inscribed marks, the Little Ice Age period ranks highest among the high flood levels, with the flood levels thereafter getting progressively lower in the 1800s, which had been the time when the sun was getting stronger again during the solar warming period. According to the inscription, the 1920 flood level ranks the lowest, as one would expect. Only the year 1954 doesn't fit the trend. The sun was strong in 1954, according to the sunspot numbers. We should not have had high flood levels in this time frame. In fact, the sunspot numbers were still increasing in 1954, towards the peak in the 1960s. We shouldn't have seen the high flood level occurring in 1954, for which large volumes of cosmic ray flux are required. This tells us that something big and unusual had happened on the sun at this time. When one plots the inscribed high flood levels, the decline in flood levels to the 1920s is well within the range of what one would expect as the result of the upramping of the sun from the Little Ice Age onward. One would also expect the 2002 level to be higher than the one in 1920, since the sun was weaker again in 2002. But the hugely high level in 1954 simply doesn't fit the historic narrative. Something very big must have happened. The big cause may have been the reversal of the solar dynamics that ended the nearly 300 years upramping of the sun and had started the now ongoing collapse phase in solar activity. When such big events happen to something as big as the sun, large shocks typically happen also. Shocks tend to be of short duration, however, whereby they don't show up in the sunspot number records. The year 1954 may have been that year of the big shocks that started the eventual turnaround in solar activity. That something big happened in this time frame is indicated in the beryllium-10 measurements too. Note that a deep down spike occurred during the valley between the highest sunspot cycles of the 1960s and the one before. The blue down spike represents a corresponding up spike in solar cosmic ray flux. It becomes interesting when one correlates the recorded high flood levels with the beryllium-10 measurements. For each of the dates inscribed on the wall in Passau, a corresponding downspike occurred that represents high rates of cosmic ray flux, and with it high rates of cloud nucleation. The only inscription that is missing on the wall at Passau is an entry for the late 1600s, when the cosmic ray spikes were the largest. The extreme situation may have developed into droughts instead of floods. According to modern research conducted in the USA, 6 significant periods of drought had occurred in the United States Northeast in the 1600s, including a mega drought that had lasted for 2 decades. Of course, now that the sun is getting weaker again, the historic rates of flooding resumed. The effect is felt both in Europe, as it is shown here, and also halfway around the world in the USA, like the flooding in 2011 that had inundated neighborhoods in New England and the mid-Atlantic states in places that had remained above water ever since they had been built. That's a part of the phase of the climate reversal that began in the 1960s, with the first shocks being felt in 1954. It makes sense that the first shocks would have occurred during the valley portion of the solar cycles, prior to the actual turnaround of the climate from the 1600s on. In this case of the 1954 shock, the shock occurred in the valley between the solar cycles 18 and 19. All the big climate events have occurred almost exclusively during the valley's portion between solar cycles, which are periods of low solar activity, but periods of high cosmic ray flux. For purposes of identification, I began to label the valleys as Cygni valleys, with a reference to the solar cycle numbers on either side of them. I call them Cygni valleys in honor of the star NML Cygni, a hypergiant star that is the second largest star known to us. The star is so large that it outshines our Sun 270,000-fold. The star is 1,183 times larger than the Sun and has 20 to 50 times its mass, contained in 1.65 billion times its volume. But in spite of its enormous size and luminosity, the star Cygni is a star that no one has ever actually seen. It is hidden behind a nebula of its own creation, where it has been detected by its effects with the aid of science and has been measured with advanced instrumentation. The discovery of the star was so significant in astronomy, perhaps for its elusive nature, that the initials of its discovery, Nuceboyer, Mars, and Leighton, became attached to the name of the star. Historically, the giant star NML Cygni was not discovered until 1965, which was the very year in which the equally big solar collapse took another leap forward. I see the Cygni valleys in solar activity between solar cycles as elusive, unprotected valleys of peak solar cosmic ray flux, which no one can actually see directly either, but which can be recognized by their effects. The Cygni Valley events have an elusive quality that is similar to that of the giant star Cygni. That's what brings the name Cygni into the context. Cosmic rays are invisible, but they can be discerned by their effects. They can even be measured in proxy in the form of carbon-14 ratios and in beryllium-10 ratios and in other related phenomena. Cosmic rays come in a wide range of flavors. According to a study, solar cosmic rays occur up to 1,000 events per square meter per second, while galactic cosmic rays occur on average at a rate of only 1 event per square meter per year, but of a vastly higher energy per particle. And extragalactic events occur 1,000,000 times fewer than that, although with ultra-high energies. The extremely high rate at which the solar cosmic rays events are occurring makes these the chief candidates for cosmic-forced climate effects on Earth. In this context, the 1954 event that occurred within the Cygni Valley 18 to 19 can be recognized as a major solar cosmic ray event, by which the year 1954 became a turbulent year around the world in terms of flooding events. In the decade from 1954 onward, the world was also enormously changed in yet another context. The age of the grand solar minima appears to have irreversibly ended in this time frame. We saw the Wolf solar minimum in the 1300s, the Spörer minimum in the 1500s, and the Maunder minimum in the 1600s. These minima were periods of low solar activity that the Sun recovered from. In these cases, the term minimum applied, because a recovery happened. This is also what makes the continued use of the term minimum in the solar context dangerously erroneous. One hears much talk about the next grand minimum to be happening in the near future. The danger with this concept is that it implies that no matter how bad things may get, there will be a recovery happening thereafter so that we can get by simply weathering the storm. That's a dangerous deception because there will be no recovery happening. No further recovery is possible. The line has been crossed. For us to be able to survive, we need to take the steps to avoid the consequences. Nothing will spare us from that. If we don't respond, we will not survive. That's what makes the continued use of the term minimum dangerous, because there is no recovery, as the term implies. Not this time. From the time the solar collapse phase began, from 1954 onward, the term minimum no longer applies in the solar context. The solar system is now in its final collapse process towards the ultimate phase shift in the 2050s that starts the next full ice age. The age of the historic recoveries is over. The age of the collapse has begun. The dynamics have diminished too much for the recovery of the Sun to be possible, at least not for the next 100,000 years. The background in solar strength has diminished too far for recovery to happen before the threshold level is crossed at which the phase shift to the next ice age occurs. The big solar turnaround year, 1954, started with a shock, though not a giant shock. It started with the Laredo flooding in Texas in May, followed by an extremely large 4-month flooding of the Yangtze River in China, and Hurricane Hazel ravaging Canada. 1954 was also the year of the historic cyclone disaster in Australia, with the flooding there of the city of Lismore. And in between all that, on July 10, the already noted 1954 Danube River flooding event happened in Europe. In the same year too, just prior to the Danube flooding, in late June, Hurricane Alice had swept across Mexico into Texas with 110-mile-per-hour winds, and Hurricane Hazel had swept far into the north as far as Toronto in Canada. Hurricane Alice had dumped another 20 inches of rain in 12 hours onto the already flooded Laredo region, leaving 100 people dead in its wake. Yes, Some big events had happened on the Sun in the year 1954 that caused these effects, which also set the stage for ever more of the same to come, which had indeed happened. Actually, the case of the hurricanes is somewhat less significant. Every year is hurricane season. Sometimes as many as 15 hurricanes occur in the Atlantic region in a single year, with up to 7 of these in the high categories. Typically the numbers are lower than that, except for the years 1954 and 1955, which stand out against the background, with 2 of the most costly and deadly hurricanes in the decade occurring in these years. In Haiti, Hurricane Hazel had destroyed 40% of the coffee trees and 50% of the coca crop. Then it traveled northward, 1,090 kilometers overland, till it stalled over the Greater Toronto area in Canada, where it caused flooding and other major damages. No one in Canada had been prepared back in 1954 for having to deal with a tropical storm, much less a major one. These are a few examples of the effects that can be caused by large solar cosmic ray events of the type that have heralded the big solar reversal towards the now ongoing solar collapse process. We are not facing another minimum, or even a grand minimum. We are in an already ongoing grand solar collapse, a process towards the 100,000 years super ice age, like the one we had in the past, that will be starting anew in the 2050s, which we cannot avoid. Only after the long deep ice age, 100,000 years from now, will the sun recover again to give us the kind of climate that we enjoy presently and should enjoy while it lasts. Unfortunately, we have no way of knowing what specifically had happened on the Sun that had made the year 1954 so special in terms of cosmic forced natural disasters. The technology didn't exist at the time that gives us measurable data for these types of events. The year 1954 preceded the space age and its amazing capabilities that we now have. We are now able to look at the sun from space and observe it in wavelengths of light that the eye cannot see, and we get updates many times per hour, day after day. We can see the slightest changes now that in earlier times we hadn't imagined to be possible. It may well be that 1954 was the year when the 300 years solar upramping ended, instead of after the 1960s as the sunspot numbers indicate. In this case, when a large cosmic transformation takes place, such as from the solar upramping to the solar collapse, big effects on Earth would logically result from the big events on the Sun, as in the example shown here when a coronal hole extended across nearly the entire face of the Sun. The 1954 events were evidently big enough to qualify as the outcome of big solar fluctuations. During the great transition period in the solar system, major dynamic shocks may have rippled through the system on a scale that will never be known. The technologies for this knowledge certainly didn't exist at the time when the Danube River flooded out of step with the historic patterns. It took us many years to discover a firm measurement that proved with absolute measures that the sun was getting weaker after the 1960s, as the sunspot numbers suggested it does. And the soil temperature measurements in Irkutsk indicate. The missing measurement that proves that the sun was rapidly weakening after the 1960s was provided by the Ulysses satellite that began orbiting the sun in a polar orbit in 1994. It saw the solar wind pressure diminishing, and the solar magnetic field diminishing, and solar cosmic ray levels increasing. When the mission had terminated in 2008, the measurements it had provided gave us a clear direction of where we are heading and how much time we may have remaining before the phase shift to the next ice age happens. Since the dawn of the space age, we now have the capability to observe the sun in a manner that never has been possible before, which of course confirms the rate of change that the Ulysses mission had seen the beginning of. The image of the sun that is shown here was observed by the SOHO satellite on October 11, 2015. This occurred 7 years after the Ulysses satellite had measured the sun's rate of diminishing. Also, what we see here on the sun has had its corresponding effects on the Earth. In early October in 2015, the 1 in 1,000 years heavy rain had occurred in the Carolinas in the USA that had caused a large flooding event of historic dimensions. What we see here on the face of the sun from this time frame indicates that it is now possible to use coronal hole data as the SOHO and SDO satellites provide as a proxy to measure and track solar weaknesses, especially in later times when sunspots no longer occur on the face of the sun. The limit of this technology is that we can only measure what is occurring, not what will be occurring in the future. For this knowledge of what the future holds for us, we need to project forward in time what we have already seen and know. We can do this based on the principles that we have discovered. The two images shown here are less than 2 years apart in timing. The difference that we see may be typical of a trend, and it is dramatic. We need to project forward what we see here of the solar diminishing to what we will likely see with the trend continuing for another 30 to 35 years. The consequences are scary to imagine. They would be scary indeed if we didn't have the capability to evade the consequences. Fortunately, we have the capability at hand to avoid future flooding disasters by simply relocating our agriculture into indoor facilities and place them afloat onto the equatorial seas between the hurricane bands, together with the related major cities. Cyclones and hurricanes are not happening there. Earthquakes have no effect there either. Neither is flooding a possibility for infrastructures that are already afloat on the sea. By living afloat on the equatorial seas, We will live safely, no matter what the future may bring in terms of the projected ever greater natural calamities. Of course, we ultimately have to be there, staged across the equatorial seas when the full ice age begins, potentially in the 2050s, with a dramatically weaker and colder sun that emits 70% less solar light and heat energy. With this in mind, which we cannot avoid, I would like to suggest that a large-scale relocating of ourselves under the sea will be happening. When we consider the scientific knowledge seriously that we presently have, it becomes self-evident how we need to respond in the near term to the ever larger flooding events and the other so-called natural catastrophes that we suffer already too many of. In order to protect our agriculture and our cities, we have no other option available except to relocate both to where they cannot be flooded, be destroyed by earthquakes, and be devastated by tornadoes, cyclones, and hurricanes. We really have no additional option. If we follow this only option that we have open to us, as demanding as this option is, we will live safely in the future and be ready for the big astrophysical climate change by which the next ice age starts, and the regions outside the tropics become uninhabitable under the then 70% dimmer and colder sun. But will we move in this direction? Will we even take the hint? The increasing flooding disasters are the proverbial writing on the wall in our time. Will we decipher the writing? Will we heed the message? I think we will. I think the flooding challenges will inspire us to get a move on. While the large earthquakes are enormously destructive, society sees no alternative in its small-minded mode but to quietly suffer them. Thus the earthquakes are suffered evermore. Ultimately, this means suffering big time. The Sichuan earthquake all by itself had caused more than 87,000 dead, 13,000 missing, 340,000 injuries, 11 million people to become homeless, and damages amounting to close to $150 billion. That's enormous suffering for a single event. But the large flooding events are worse than the earthquakes are. Earthquakes don't repeat their devastation at the same place and tend to be contained in a small area. Consequently, they are suffered more easily. The destroyed areas are typically rebuilt. In comparison, the big floods affect many times more people and destroy their food resources with wide and far-reaching consequences. In many cases, the flooding had also destroyed agricultural lands altogether. The big factor in flooding, however, is not so much the damage that the flooding had historically caused, but is the potential damage in future years that will likely be caused with the sun becoming progressively weaker for the next 30 years. Most flood control measures are focused on historic averages rather than on future peak potentials. And that's scary because the historic examples that we have already seen too much of, though being small, tell horrific tales. In many cases, the tragedy is built into the terrain itself. Consider the snake-like shape of the Mississippi River, for example. Such a winding river is not conducive to fast-running flows, whereby the river channel itself becomes a major barrier. In the summer of 1926, for example, the central basin of the Mississippi River received extremely heavy rains. By September, the Mississippi's contributary in Kansas and Iowa were swollen to capacity. On Christmas Day in 1926, the Cumberland River at Nashville in Tennessee rose to a level that remains a record to this very day. The high water broke levees in 145 places and flooded more than 70,000 square kilometers of land. The flood left more than 700,000 people homeless. Roughly 500 people died in the flooding. The damages were immense, comparable to 1/3 of the federal budget of the USA at that time. If the event had occurred in 2007, the resulting damages would have totaled roughly $1 trillion. The flood affected Missouri, Illinois, Kansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. Arkansas was the hardest hit, with 14% of its entire territory covered by floodwater. By May 1927, the Mississippi River below Memphis, Tennessee, became a sea of water nearly 100 kilometers wide. That's 60 miles. The Mississippi flood disaster in 1926 wasn't caused by a flash flood event, but was merely caused by a lot of rain. The conditions for continent-wide flash floods didn't even exist in 1926. This means that the big Mississippi flooding was caused simply by prolonged heavy rainfall, which isn't surprising when one considers that a flooding event occurred at the low point between two sunspot cycles. At such times, larger volumes of cosmic ray flux are emitted. The cosmic ray connection that affects all climate events becomes more readily apparent by the nature of flash floods. Flash floods events are necessarily short-lived because the coronal holes rotate with the surface of the sun and become thereby rotated away from the direction to the Earth. The result is that the cosmic ray showers impacting the Earth rarely last more than 3 days. Once the cosmic ray shower is over, the torrential rain showers cease. The modern torrential rainfalls are typically small and short in duration, in the range of 1 to 3 days. Most appear to be caused by extreme cosmic ray showers that are enabled by large coronal holes on the Sun. As the coronal holes rotate away from the Earth, the torrential rains stop. During 3 days in November 1927, November 2 to 4, in the northern USA, the Great Vermont flood occurred. This brief flash flood of 3 days destroyed 1,285 bridges and killed at least 84 people. The flash flood event is typically localized to areas where the conditions already exist for nucleation to be nearly fulfilled. The cosmic ray caused ionization of the air merely takes the cloud nucleation process over the edge and gives it a massive boost. This may have happened in Vermont during the 3 fateful days in November 1927. The Vermont event in 1927 was significant by its short time span. Most modern torrential rainfalls are typically for them being short in duration, mostly in the range of 1 to 3 days. This makes them candidates to have been caused by extreme cosmic ray showers emitted through coronal holes. Continent-wide flash floods were likely not possible in 1927, when the sun was still relatively weak, but they are possible now. An example for such a potential occurred in 2015. After years of harsh drought conditions, a large flash flood suddenly erupted in May 2015. It extended from Texas all the way to Canada. The flood event was likely caused by a major coronal hole opening up on the surface of the sun that had briefly opened a window for an extreme volume of solar cosmic rays reaching the Earth. As I said before, the cosmic rays ionize elements in the atmosphere, which thereby become 100 times more attractive to water vapor to enable cloud nucleation than they are in a non-activated state. When this happens in areas where conditions are naturally conducive to cloud forming, a major cosmic ray showers can massively enhance the cloud forming and rain-making process. When the entire face of the sun becomes increasingly full of holes, like a sieve, far more than what we see here, instead of how it used to be, shown on the left, then we see the stage developing for long enduring rainfalls that can result in major flooding on the ground, extended for weeks and months. And of course, now that the sun is getting ever weaker and the cosmic ray showers getting ever larger, the floods themselves are bound to be getting larger too. That's an effect that we can only see the beginning of. We have no way of knowing precisely where it will all end. As I said before, in many cases, the potential for horrific flooding is built into the terrain itself, like the snake-like shape of the Mississippi River. The ever-turning and twisting river had become a major barrier in times of big volumes of floodwaters. The Mississippi River has thereby the same type of dangerous flooding quality that the Mesopotamia basin has. The kind of geography that enables epic floods exists in Mesopotamia. In fact, it exists similarly in most of the big river basins in the world. Mesopotamia is a shallow bowl surrounded by mountains, with major rivers flowing into it, with only a single outflow being available for it. A major flash flood, extended for weeks, could turn much of this flood bowl into a lake, with several major rivers draining vast areas of the surrounding land into this flood bowl. The resulting immense accumulation could create a flood lake as big as an inland sea. Such epic flooding, as may have happened a long time ago, is not upon us yet, but promises to become common in the 2040s as the sun continues to weaken at such a fast rate that the solar wind pressure will be diminished to zero in the 2030s, with the sun itself becoming colder thereafter. Of course, when the epic flooding stage is reached, regardless of which river system is affected, food production will be largely ended. This may happen in many places simultaneously. Are we prepared to let this happen? As I said before, the big epic flooding events are not upon us yet, but they promise to become so in the 2040s, with the sun now weakening at such a fast rate that the solar wind pressure diminishes at a rate of 30% in 10 years. The type of geography that enables epic floods of the type that exists in Mesopotamia exists simultaneously in almost all the big river systems in the world. Many of the great world rivers are located in shallow flood bowls, surrounded by barriers with numerous contributaries flowing into it, and with only a single outflow available. With the rivers draining vast areas of surrounding land, all flowing together into the flood bowl, immense flooding events become easily possible when the rainfalls become intensely increased with cosmic ray showers, whereby large areas of land turn into a giant lake, as in biblical times. The Mississippi River Basin has this potential. It drains almost 3 million square kilometers of land into a single bowl that flows out through a single narrow gap. So what's the message in all that? The message is clear, isn't it? It is that large-scale agriculture, which we cannot afford to lose to the now increasing flooding, including the cities that are associated with the agricultural areas, need to be relocated afloat onto the seas where flooding is not possible. Without a secure food supply and without secure places to live in, humanity loses the foundation for its existence. Historically, the large river basins have provided the food security for the surrounding populations. Fertile soils and ample water for irrigation have enabled efficient large-scale agricultural production. Our civilization rests on this platform. Almost the entire world depends on this platform now. This platform proved to be ideal under the natural climate conditions that until now have prevailed. It enabled the great agricultural revolution, but now suddenly a shock point is encountered. The vast agricultural machinery that we have developed and depend on is thrown into danger of becoming devastated. We are close to that. This means that a whole new agricultural revolution is required, with a new basis that has never existed before. Even Russia is not secure anymore on this very basis. In the Russian heartland, the Volga River Basin, where much of Russia's food is grown, is a ready-made natural flood bowl. And again, there exists just a single outflow through a narrow gap where the Volga River flows into the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea itself is the world's largest lake. It is unique in that it has no outflow at all. The mighty Volga River flows into this lake and evaporates there. In recent times, the Volga River has become so weak that the lake began to shrink in size. The reverse lays before us now. While Russia is still relatively unaffected by cyclonic storms, which keep the Volga system at borderline conditions, the borderline may soon be crossed. When the epic era begins, the mighty Volga basin too becomes endangered with mega flooding. While the sun continues to weaken, the threshold for this to happen comes ever nearer. Can you imagine what happens when the vast Volga River catchment basin gets flooded with 10 feet of rain? Much of Russia in the Volga basin will become utterly devastated, and the Caspian Sea will overfill. It will then flow back through the Don River and out into the Black Sea, while ever more of the lowlands around the Black Sea become flooded. Much of Europe has the same epic flooding potential along the Danube River basin, which drains a large portion of Central Europe. The bottom line is that we haven't seen anything yet in terms of large flooding events. With a water vapor density of 1% in the air and the troposphere extending to 10,000 feet, the atmosphere holds 100 feet of water in vaporized form. We live with 100 feet of water over our head. The real figure is varied, of course. In some areas it could be several times larger. How great a portion of this enormous volume of water in the air will become condensed into rain at a given time depends on how weak the sun becomes over time and how large its coronal holes can become in the process of the sun getting weaker. And that's scary to contemplate. Just consider that only 10 feet of this invisible pool becomes turned into rain in the space of a day or a few days. The consequences are unimaginable, and they will be so, should we not react to what we know and thereby prevent the consequences, such as by creating new agriculture and new cities afloat on the equatorial seas. Many people insist that the world's development project on such a gigantic scale will never be happening. But is this true? In early times it had become expedient to locate the developing cities at the banks of the rivers, as in the case of the Yellow River shown here. The placement happened naturally because the rivers offered easy transportation and an always available source of water. But now, in the age of the big floods, the cities that have been built at the edge of the river have become highly vulnerable. The historic convenience now poses a problem, a very great problem in many cases, for which answers involve the radical transformation of many parts of the world, such as relocating entire cities and their livelihood to a large degree onto the sea. But will the needed steps be taken? I like to think that these types of cultural revolutions are difficult, but will happen. The imperatives for them to happen are great. Equally great is the joy that flows from accomplishing great achievements. Why would we even want to deprive us of this joy by remaining procrastinated and imprisoned by small-minded notions? Large-scale floating infrastructures are basically easy to create with automated industrial production methods that can be scaled up to the gigantic scale that is needed. The solar system is in a free-fall collapse, as it were. We know this. We have seen it in fringe effects. The Ulysses spacecraft had measured the cause for them. It measured the solar wind pressure diminishing at a rate of 30% in 10 years. That's a free-fall collapse on the cosmic time frame. The sunspot numbers are likewise diminishing. The solar cycle 25 in the mid-2020s will likely be spotless. This takes us back in time 300 years to the Little Ice Age, when similar conditions were encountered. And in the 2030s, the solar wind will have diminished to zero, with ever larger volumes of solar cosmic ray flux reaching the Earth. We may be seeing gigantic flash floods occurring for weeks across the large river basins of the world, where most of the world's food is grown. We may be seeing floods on an epic scale that we have never encountered in the history of civilization, except wrapped up in myths described in biblical stories. While the big epic floods are still a few decades distant, possibly as far distant as the 2040s, the potential for them needs to be considered in the present, because it takes time and large-scale efforts to implement the needed corrective actions and processes. The urgency for this, therefore, exists now. It needs to be acted on now, even while the dangers ahead remains largely unseen, though the danger is great. When the global food supply begins to fail, almost globally, as it will, the consequences become unthinkable and catastrophic, should we have failed to react to what we know now. That's why the subject of the epic flooding becomes important for us in the present, where we still have a chance to prevent the catastrophic events from occurring. China has the potential to become a world leader in this arena, because the already severe flooding, which China has been seen far too much of already in all of its 5 river basins, may inspire the nation in time to rouse itself to get the ball rolling towards securing its existence. India and Bangladesh are similarly affected, and to some degree also is the USA. In contrast, it is extremely unlikely that Russia and Europe, like Canada, can be sufficiently motivated to save its existence, for the simple reason that the ongoing flooding events in their respective regions are too small to inspire people to change their world, even while the number of flooding events has already increased 5-fold since the time when the big weakening of the sun began, and ever more flood events are being caused by heavy rainfall instead of melting snow. The same, however, cannot be said about the places like China, where a major portion of the entire country is affected by flooding, and is affected in an existential manner by the destruction of crops and farmlands. Here it gets scary for China, because as the rainfalls increase, the large river systems can become a trap. The kind of trap that the biblical flooding story hints at. As I said before, The kind of geography that enables epic floods of the type that exists in Mesopotamia exists similarly in most of the big river basins in the world. Mesopotamia is a shallow bowl surrounded by mountains, with major rivers flowing into it, with only a single outflow available, with the inflowing rivers draining vast areas of the surrounding land, all flowing together into the flood bowl with a single outflow. China experienced a foretaste of what this means. China's huge August 1931 flood event in the Yangtze River Basin had killed 3.7 million people. The flood had covered 77,700 square kilometers of land and the cities of Nanjing and Wuhan, and had left 40 million people homeless. Many of the millions who died in the flood perished by starvation, disease, and other things even after the flood waters had receded. The rice fields that had dominated the landscape before had been swamped. The crops that the people depended on were gone. In the major cities, countless masses starved to death, and many were infected with typhoid and dysentery that became rampant by the polluted waters. Since then, more efficient flood control infrastructures had been built. Nevertheless, the subsequent big floods continued to be enormously destructive. The big 1954 China flood left 30,000 dead, and the latter flood of 1998 left still 3,650 dead. The Three Gorges Dam project was created in the wake of these disasters. It became the largest civil engineering achievement in the world, designed to prevent future mega flooding. While it proved to be effective during the extraordinarily rainy summer of 2010, by holding back a large portion of the upstream floodwaters, it couldn't prevent the huge mega flood of 2010 altogether. The waters of the vast upstream catchment basin of 1 million square kilometers in size, including from the high mountains in Tibet, all convergent flows through the Three Gorges Dam and are controlled by it. Nevertheless, the dam still had to open its floodgates in 2010 to reduce the high water volume in the reservoir behind it. The 2010 China flood began in early May 2010. Most of the flood's damage was occurred below the dam. The dam had been effective in containing the upstream floodwaters to a large extent. By the time the 2010 flooding had ended, at the end of August, the flooding and landslides had killed more than 3,000 people. It had affected the life of more than 230 million people in 28 provinces. In the course of the flooding, 1,360,000 houses had been destroyed, and more than 97,200 square kilometers of crops had been inundated. 16 million hectares of farmland had been affected by the flooding, of which 2 million hectares were completely devastated. In the spring before the big 2010 flood happened, the Pearl River region, a large water-rich region located south of the Yangtze River, had been hit with a severe drought, though this hardly seemed possible. Then suddenly the big China-wide flooding began. Lesser floods were experienced in 2011, 2013, 2015 and 2016, including the flooding of the city of Beijing in 2012 and 2016. In the summer of 2016, another relatively big flooding happened in China, though far less extensive. This time the flooding had affected only 32 million people instead of the 230 million people, as in 2010, and only 3,000 square kilometers of crops were destroyed instead of the 97,000 square kilometers that were destroyed in 2010. Nevertheless, the flooding was so extensive that it could be seen from space. Below the Three Gorges Dam, Mark III, a wide low-elevation terrain extends from Beijing to the southern border. The central section of this large low-elevation area drains into the Yangtze. While extensive flood control measures had been installed, they proved to be insufficient. Ultimately, no effective defense measures are possible to contain the potentially enormously increasing volumes of floodwaters that future increases in cosmic ray flux almost assure, according to the dynamics of the weakening sun. The less severe flood damage during the more controlled disasters in 2016 was so massive in the flatlands near the river that the aftermath could be seen from space after the storms had cleared. What the future may bring when the rainfall during the big storms increased tenfold, activated by large cosmic ray showers, cannot be imagined. Nevertheless, that's what humanity needs to prepare for. Infrastructures for flood protection are installed across all of China. The flood prevention appears to be especially difficult for the Yellow River, located north of the Yangtze. The Yellow River is nearly twice as long as the Colorado River in the USA, and has a slightly larger catchment basin. But apart from that, it is incomparable. Its upper reach drains a large area of the Tibetan Plain with 2 lakes above 14,000 feet in elevation. The water runs clear, flowing out of the Tibetan Mountains, where 3 rivers combine and flow from there through the lowest plateau in a big loop. Fed by 30 large tributaries in that region, the river almost doubles in flow volume and picks up 92% of its silt. That's where its problem begins. As the silt collects at the bottom of the river and thereby raises the water level, the river overflows frequently and finds a new course, especially during flood conditions. In more modern times, the river became contained artificially to its now levee-bound course for over 700 kilometers across the North China Plain before it empties into the Bohai Sea. However, as over time the river rose ever higher by its silt deposits, the levee building process eventually created an elevated river that in some places now flows 30 feet above the surrounding landscape. which is thereby divided into two. The area north of the levees drains towards Beijing. The area to the south drains into the Yangtze River. When the levees are breached by mega floods, the consequences are unimaginable. In comparison with that, the building of floating infrastructures across the equatorial sea will one day be regarded as a vastly more attractive alternative to suffering the consequences of the flooding that become ever more costly. The river system that is located immediately to the south of the Yellow River is the Ui River. This system is half as long as the Colorado, but had originally drained directly into the Yellow Sea. However, in distant times before the levees were built, the ever-changing course of the Yellow River had cut across the course of the Ui River and had deposited so much silt in its path that it blocked off the Ui River and caused it to flow into the Yangtze River basin instead. This massive natural river diversion illustrates to some degree the enormous magnitude of the potential for flooding events in this region. Back in 1887, the Yellow River had breached the then rather primitive dikes. The event flooded 130,000 square kilometers of the low plain. It killed 900,000 people and left 2 million homeless. The dikes have been improved, of course. But what if the river's 750,000 square kilometers of catchment basin gets showered with 10 feet of rain per day in big storms, instead of just 2 feet, as we now see it in extreme cases? Will the beefed-up modern dikes system have the capacity to handle this type of flow? The question needs to be asked, because the 10-foot rain could happen. It could happen in the 2040s, when the sun has weakened so extremely that very large volumes of cosmic ray flux may be encountered for long periods. Tragically, nobody is asking this question, perhaps out of fear of what the answers might require. The 2010 time frame for these events falls within the Cygni Valley 23 to 24 period of low sunspot activity that is reflected in the increased cosmic ray flux. This means that the 2010 timeframe events and the more recent 2016 events at the start of the 24-25 Cygni Valley are all linked to each other by them being directly related to weak states of the sun in the larger theater of the collapse of the solar system towards the start of the next ice age. In other words, we are seeing the effects now of the multiple interrelated astrophysical weakening that has far-reaching consequences and that have just barely begun to unfold. Perhaps the big 1931 flood disaster in China, in which upwards to 4 million people perished, resulted from an enormous increase in cyclone storms in that area. In a typical year, 2 cyclone storms occur in that region. In 1931, however, 7 such storms occurred in a single month, in the month of July. These shouldn't have happened. It is said that no one could have foreseen this. This may have been true then, because the astrophysical dynamics had not been understood then. But now With that event having been recognized as located within the Cygni Valley where the big events happen, the flooding event is no longer surprising. With the discovery of the enormous effect of cosmic ray flux on the cloud-forming process, the dramatic increases in cyclone storms had become recognizable as a simple consequence of the weaker sun, even while the solar cycle was modulated on to the gradual up-ramping of the sun. In areas like China, where the natural conditions for storm events exist, a large cosmic ray shower can increase the cloud nucleation almost instantly and explosively. The storm clouds can grow enormously rapid. They can increase as rapidly as the nucleation increase had been measured with the cloud experiment at the CERN laboratory in Europe, where artificial cosmic rays were injected into a test chamber and the effects had been measured. It is also a known fact that the process of cloud nucleation releases the latent energy that was invested when the liquid water became transformed into vapor. This latent energy, in the form of latent heat, becomes released when the water vapor condenses into water again. The released latent heat gives the clouds their buoyancy. In extreme cases, especially in the tropics that are warm to begin with, the increased buoyancy can lift the clouds to high elevations where the electric connection with the ionosphere becomes dramatically increased, which further increases the cloud nucleation. Enormously dense rainfalls can result from this type of dynamic interplay. In extreme cases, cyclones can start out of the blue. One hears much talk about the El Nino oscillations having a causative effect for the large storms. The effect, however, appears to be too minuscule to be largely significant. The airflow is driven by the trade winds. The El Nino variations may well be a subsequent effect of the Earth's changing climate patterns, rather than being causative for it. The really big climate change considerations always lead us back to the big factor, the cosmic ray factor, that affects the climate process on Earth more enormously than anything else, and is the only big variable climate factor that we have measurements for. The dramatic effect is now on the increase at a very fast rate, with the sun getting progressively weaker. With the cosmic ray flux now increasing, which is reflected in the very weak sunspot cycle 24, the storm effects are likewise increasing and are creeping ever deeper into the subtropics. In 2012, the flooding zone had reached northward in China all the way to Beijing, with the flooding of the city that year. The flooding of the city had happened again in 2014 and once more in 2016. Beijing is located roughly the same latitude as St. Louis on the Mississippi in the USA. We have seen tornadoes increasing in the USA in the same time frame in the Mississippi Basin. In 1999, an amazing 312 tornadoes struck in the Mississippi Basin in a 3-day period. But this was just the beginning. The year 2008 was worse. with close to 1,700 tornadoes ravaging the landscape that year, of which 85 occurred in just 15 hours. Then came the big year, 2011, with 1,700 tornadoes, with winds up to 340 kilometers an hour, causing 5,370 injuries, 553 fatalities, 219 in just a single day, and 10 billion in damage. 2016 was a lesser big year, with only 900 tornadoes occurring and only 17 deaths. However, the 2016 tornado season, that was expected to be lean, had its third most active first 2 months in 10 years. These are some of the tragic fringe effects of the sun getting weaker, whereby larger volleys of cosmic ray flux are hitting the Earth, so that nothing is historically predictable anymore, as additional principles come into play. The general weakening of the sun is further modulated with the effects of the solar activity cycles that are built into the solar system. The big climate effects are therefore more likely to happen during the low periods in sunspot numbers. In 2016, with the sunspot numbers diminishing to low values, larger volumes of solar cosmic ray flux would have occurred, so that we saw an increase in big events occurring. Together with the 2016 tornadoes, we saw increasing floods along the southern Mississippi and also the big 2016 Louisiana flooding. And this too appears to have been just the beginning. But if this is the beginning, where does the train stop? How much of the big river basins, like that of the Mississippi, which are typically the main food production centers, with many large cities being located right at the rivers, will become lost to the increasing flood damages? Nobody knows the answer. As I said before, another example of this type is the city of Chongqing in China, a city of over 30 million people. 5 major rivers are flowing together into this prehistoric flood bowl, with the city of Chongqing in the center. One of the inflows is the Yangtze River itself, flowing out of the Tibetan High Plateau. Consider that 1 million square kilometers of land is drained by the river, flowing into the region, for which only one single outflow exists, via the Yangtze River that flows through the famous Three Gorges, where the river cuts through a chain of mountains for 200 kilometers, ending at the Three Gorges Dam. That this region is a flood bowl is evident by the flooding events that are already happening to some degree. Consider that only a single outflow exists through the narrow natural barrier of the Yangtze Gorges. What great volume of water must flow through that narrow channel when 1 million square kilometers upstream are drenched with 3 feet of rain or 10 feet? The narrow gorge becomes a choke point then. The upstream flood bowl becomes a lake, with the city of Chongqing located within it. How does one evacuate a city of 30 million people, or an entire area that is inhabited by nearly 200 million people? These are questions that need to be contemplated before the events happen. While such events may still be a decade or two in the future, solutions may need to be developed to prevent such epic catastrophes. The same type of question must also be asked about the consequences of extremely heavy rains across the wide, shallow catchment basins downstream of the dam, which is already frequently ravaged by mega floods. Flash flood rainfalls in the range of 20 inches have been known. What about 100 inches of rain or more? We are looking at a terrible writing on the wall here for the near future for the entire area. No quick fix solution appears to be possible. The Earth's atmosphere holds large volumes of water, as I said before, at a 1% vapor density, and the troposphere extending roughly 10,000 feet above us. We stand at the bottom of a sea of roughly 100 feet of water, thinly dispersed as vapor. 100 feet adds up to 1,200 inches of water. Right now, whenever 30 inches of that is condensed into rain, catastrophic consequences happen. With large increases in ionization, a tenfold increase is theoretically possible and may actually happen. The biblical flood story suggests that such increases might have once occurred in distant times. With the big cosmic climate change that has begun, we may see such flooding again soon. Mesopotamia is a giant flood bowl similar to the flood basin around the city of Chongqing. Mesopotamia has a basin surrounded by mountains. It has several major rivers flowing into it and only a narrow outflow that limits the flow volume. The Yangtze River has the same flooding potential. A huge area of land drains through a single point into the sea. China has a number of dramatically large flood bowl systems that together cover the most populous regions with numerous great cities located within them. All of China drains essentially through just 3 outflows, plus one that flows through Russia. Consider 100 inches of rain extending for a few days, and the result becomes unthinkable. In India, the great Ganges River, which had been revered for millennia as the giver of life, may soon erupt with deadly consequences. The Ganges River drains roughly 1 million square kilometers of land, which is a third of that of the Mississippi. We see already large flooding happening on the Ganges, with the flooding in some cases 40 kilometers wide, as seen here from space. And this too is obviously just the beginning, with the sun continuing to weaken. Bangladesh is likewise affected by evermore flooding. Its major river that joins with the Ganges near its outflow into the Bay of Bengal has had a long history of overflowing its banks. This is now increasing. Ever more people are now affected by this flooding. Up to 100 million people. That's 2/3 of the population of Bangladesh. All live in the river delta. Although flooding is nothing unusual for this region, the mega floods are new. The Brahmaputra is a bit shorter than the Mississippi River, within 1/5 of the size of the drainage basin, but it carries more water, almost twice as much. When this river floods, it floods big. The effects can be hugely devastating. During the 1998 flood, over 70% of the land area of Bangladesh was inundated. It affected 31 million people, a fifth of the population. More recently, in the 2004 floods, in which a quarter of the population of Bangladesh was affected, 800 lives were lost. 952,000 houses were destroyed, and another 1.4 million were badly damaged. These are horrendous losses for a small nation, especially when one considers that all this is just the beginning. The USA is extremely vulnerable to losing its food supply when a mega flood wipes out its farming infrastructure in the Mississippi Basin. The 10-foot rainfall within a day or two is not impossible when extreme cloud ionization takes place, and more so when cyclones are drawing ever more water vapor into them. The effect that this would have has not yet been seen in all the history of civilization. It is actually unimaginable. And still it can be worse. We are moving into a period of increasing solar weakening, with cosmic ray volumes that have never been experienced before. Nor do we know how large the volumes of solar cosmic ray flux may ultimately become that we will encounter over the next 30 years, of the sun becoming constantly weaker. Here history can give us a hint. As I had noted earlier, no major flooding was indicated in the historic records inscribed on the wall in Passau for the Maunder minimum period of the 1600s. This period at the end of the 1600s gave us the largest volumes in cosmic ray flux, but no big flooding occurred in this time frame. I had noted, however, that during the 1600s, when huge floods should have occurred, a century of droughts had occurred instead, with the largest drought lasting for 2 decades. If this was the final writing on the wall, we might be looking at mega droughts worldwide, with agriculture fizzing out into nothing, instead of mega floods drowning the lands in the 2030s and 40s. If mega droughts were to happen when the weakening of the sun takes on extreme dimensions, we would be in big trouble, the way we are now. Large-scale irrigation systems with global dimensions are impossible to create fast enough. Large-scale water development projects, if they are possible at all during drought conditions, are long-term projects. Ultimately, droughts are worse than flooding. Floods affect only specific areas. Droughts affect everything, including the forests. But why should we worry? Floating agriculture laid out across the equatorial sea, supplied with fresh water by deep ocean reverse osmosis desalination, would thereby be independent of rain. There are plenty of deep oceans along the equator. Neither is it possible to determine how much larger the volumes of solar cosmic ray flux may be after the phase shift to the next ice age has occurred. When the threshold is crossed, that collapses one of the primal fields that presently keep the sun in its high-powered mode. However, why do we need to know such specific details when the principles that drive the processes are already understood? And it is also understood how the effects can be avoided. The solution is simple. Agriculture and the cities for people can be protected by them being placed afloat onto the equatorial sea between the hurricane zones. That's the principle. What is afloat on the sea cannot be flooded. Indoors agriculture can be protected no matter what happens. The details are technical. The economics are on the side of the technologies for protecting agriculture and cities by technological means, afloat in the tropics. While the economic incentive exists, it has so far not inspired corresponding actions, even while the relocation of our food infrastructure into the tropical sea is required in preparation for the start of the next ice age in the 2050s. Nevertheless, nobody knows when the balance will be shifted into high technological living before the storm-ravishing platforms become increasingly unrecoverable. While New Orleans has been rebuilt after the flooding of the city by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, many of the storm victims, after considering what the future holds, have not returned. They moved away for more secure living. This may become a trend. I suspect that once the floating technological infrastructures are beginning to be created, the lineup of people will be endless, who seek more secure food and richer platforms for living. Thus the tragedies of today are a part of the silver lining, as the tragedies will at length impel humanity to build itself the infrastructures on which its future depends. If it wasn't for this pause, society would continue to do nothing, as it has for the last 40 years, and would die of the consequences when the Ice Age resumed in the 2050s. At the present time, no movement is apparent anywhere in the world of society aiming to free itself from the deadly trap of doing nothing, while the costs incurred are mounting up. The costs of dealing with flood damages and building ever greater projects for preventing the consequences of ever larger flooding are already enormously huge and promise to increase ever more rapidly as the consequences are getting larger, so that it becomes amazingly attractive at one point in the near future to place more and more of the endangered food supply infrastructures and places for human living onto the sea. It may well be that by the time when the Ice Age phase shift happens, the necessary infrastructures for it will have been built by default and will be fully in operation, so that the Ice Age phase shift, when it happens, won't affect anything. This means that the big changes in the world that need to be achieved are actually located in the near future instead of being located in the far future, 30 or 40 years from now, when the Ice Age started happens. And those changes that are needed in the near term will need to be globally developed with global cooperation. No nation is not affected by the now ongoing astrophysical changes that affect our climate in ever larger steps with ever larger consequences. China, India, Russia, Europe, and the USA, and so on, are all similarly affected by the now increasing floods, droughts, frosts, cyclones, earthquakes, and other fringe effects of the now ongoing weakening of the sun and its cooling effect on the earth. We are bound together by this common challenge that no nation is exempted from. We are in a new war now, a war for survival, where bombs are oddly out of place, where the enemy is our own smallness in thinking, and where to win means that we raise ourselves superior to the worst that the so-called natural world has to offer, and that we come out of that fight loving instead of dying, and elevated with joy over what we have accomplished as human beings and are able to accomplish evermore.